It means that the decision on whether a person is guilty or not guilty is taken in a court after the full sifting and hearing of the evidence, and particularly the other side's evidence. I think what worries me most about modern trends is that we're living in a world where people get tried and vilified, often on social media or in the media, long before they get an opportunity for a full hearing of their own side of the argument. And it's a growing trend, and whereas 50, 60 years ago, there was a very strong sense in this country that we controlled this process so that a fair trial took place in court, the boundaries seem to have blurred out, and increasingly there's a view that you can say almost anything you like about a case when it first starts to surface, even though it may cause great prejudice to the person the defendant. When I became Attorney General, I was very concerned about the trend towards increasing news media coverage of cases in a way that caused, I thought, prejudice to fair trials by jury, where there was information that was going to be given to the jurors through the media that they would not have been able to hear in the court case. And I also had a sense, talking to my predecessors, that they had, to a large extent, given up on trying to control this, and that they just felt it was inevitable. There'd been one or two instances 10, 15 years further back where they'd attempted prosecutions for contempt and they had failed. And I felt very strongly about it, perhaps because I've got a background of having done quite a lot of criminal work. It really worried me. So I started out with an approach to the media. In fairness, the news media, particularly the print media, like to engage with attorneys general, so I went along to their conferences and I explained to them why I was so concerned about this and warned them repeatedly that I would seek to take action. And eventually, there were actually one or two instances before then. There was an online version of the Daily Mail that I prosecuted because they had shown an accused brandishing a gun when he was up for trial on firearms offences. And eventually we had the Joanna Yates murder case, which took place over a Christmas period and led to the most extraordinary sensationalist coverage. And when Mr. Jeffries, who was her landlord and a retired schoolmaster, was arrested, those two newspapers, The Sun and The Mirror, went completely to town on speculating about him, his past, anecdotes about him. And some of them were really quite extraordinary, that he had a macabre interest in death because he used to read the poetry of Christina Rossetti to his pupils. I never see anything like it. And this went on over the New Year bank holiday. To the point where, in my view, he would never have been able to have a fair trial. Now, in fact, he wasn't the correct suspect at all, despite the fact he was arrested. He was subsequently completely exonerated. It was an entirely different person who'd committed this murder, and he was able to recover substantial libel damages. But the simple fact is that a fair trial would have been impossible. And that's why I prosecuted both newspapers. And I was very pleased with the outcome, because it sent, I think, a very clear signal that this was unacceptable. And newspapers don't like being prosecuted for contempt. The fines themselves may not be huge, but that and the costs and the associated bad publicity is, I think, a real deterrent. And I think it succeeded in laying down a framework, and I then reinforced it by going back to the newspapers and the media and saying, look, we've done this now. I don't want ever to do it again, but you've really got to listen to me. There are ways in which you can report cases. The statutory framework gives you a considerable amount of freedom to ensure that important matters can still be discussed. But you've got to do it within that framework. And subsequently, some of the legal advisors to newspapers came up to me and said, thank you very much for what you've done, because you've actually given us the framework we needed. And as a consequence, it's much easier to advise editors now as to what they can and can't do. And I may be wrong, but my impression is that since then, things have been considerably better. Obviously, I haven't been focused on it since I ceased to be Attorney General in 2014. But I do have a sense that we are in a better place and we have fewer egregious examples of the newspapers simply losing all control when there's a media feeding frenzy. The question of the impact of arrest on people's future reputation and the consequences if they're arrested and never charged do trouble me. I think there is an argument that an arrested person is entitled to anonymity. I can see that the moment they're charged, that's a public matter. But I've increasingly come to the conclusion that the current system has many flaws. And indeed, in fairness, there are now some police forces that will not reveal the name of an individual they've arrested. And I think there's an argument that this could be put on a more formalised footing. Of course, there may be instances where the name of a suspect has to be made public, but I think that could simply be done by going before a judge in a magistrate's court and asking for the permission to do it. Otherwise, I do worry that the way in which people get arrested, and then, as I say, there's huge media speculation around it, is damaging to people's long-term reputation. And the whole of the unfortunate saga that we've had over the accusations of paedophilia against essentially people in public life shows to me classically what occurs when you get another media feeding frenzy fueled by a belief that there is some terrible sort of elite establishment conspiracy to cover it up. And yet at the end of the day, we've discovered that nothing of the kind ever existed. But the people who were put through it went through a deeply unpleasant period in which I have to say there is some evidence that the police actually fueled the media speculation and did it quite deliberately. And that does appall me, and I think it's got to stop.